Esmail. And once again, Zahra, thank you for that wonderful facilitation. And thank you to everyone who contributed to the whiteboard. I was able to be part of some of the conversations in the breakout rooms. And I think this is where really the most impactful, I should say, conversations happen. We're grateful for how you continue to contribute. At the end of this, we will share a bit more. We'll kind of circle back on some of the reflections we've heard and how we're hoping that we can continue this. And please be mindful as well that after now, we will share some of those resources. Some of them are already in the chat, some were shared in our breakout rooms. We'll also share the link to the personal story and the other documentary that we saw. We definitely by no means would anticipate that the conversation we start here will stop here. We expect that this is only the start to something. I'm mindful that, we've asked you for half a day today. So a number of people have been back and forth, and from time to time, we'll see some people step out for a minute and come back, and we'll just hope that as we go, we're able to get some more people throughout the conversation. But just to echo some of the things that we shared really early on, self-care is really important. Again, reflecting on the documentary that we saw, knowing that some of those things could be maybe heavy, please allow yourself space to cater to yourself and to step aside when you need to. The recording of this will be made fully available after the fact, so it's something that you can share and that you can continue to ruminate and reflect on. Okay, now we are yet at another beautiful, interesting, what I know will be a packed section of our gathering today, which is getting into the panel discussion. Honestly, I can't even tell you how lucky I feel that we're able to get the people that we have who will be speaking to and at this portion of the conversation today. I hope that you get to experience them like I have in many, many interactions before now. And I hope that you will also share with us, even as things start to resonate with you, even as things start to stand out for you. We hope that you share with us some of the things that, are resonating in the immediate, whether now or later on. Without any further ado, I will do things a bit differently. I'm not going to introduce people. I'm not going to introduce everyone. I know some of our panelists today you've met already. So I'm just going to invite them on and I'll let them introduce themselves because I think there is a lot of power in that. And I also know that a number of the people speaking today believe in the power of storytelling. So we'll leave them to introduce themselves as they prefer. So I'll go to the very first person on my screen, and that's Zahra Esmail. Zahra, would you please unmute and tell us a bit about you?
Hi, Ruth. Thank you so much. Yeah, so happy to be here today, and really lovely to see Sobhana and Yabome as well. My name is Zahra Esmail. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm calling in from my home office on the unceded lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would love to take the opportunity to just tell you a little bit about who I am. So I was born on Treaty 6 territory in what's known as Calgary. And at the age of 8, my family moved over to Burnaby. So I grew up in the Lower Mainland. This is where I went to high school. This is where I went to university. So it's always been a home. But my parents came from East Africa. My dad was born in Kenya and my mom in Tanzania. And my forefathers came from Gujarat in India. In about I don't actually know what decade, maybe the 1400s, I want to say. My family would have converted from Hinduism to Islam. And so I grew up as part of the Ismaili Muslim community. I'm non-practicing myself, but there's definitely a cultural connection with other Muslim communities and the Ismaili community as well. And this is something that I've really had to think about a lot. I actually for whatever reason, Ruth was unprepared for that first clip of the video that we saw. And
Mm,
it did actually bring me to tears. I'm glad my camera was off because it was really devastating. And I think I've thought a lot about my experience as somebody named Zahra Esmail in 2021 when 9/11 happened. And, I look at young people today and protesters and activists and young people who are asking for better, asking for more, asking for justice. And oftentimes, when I was about 18, 19 years old, that's when I know the spark was in me. And I
mm,
also remember that that's when I felt a lot of discrimination and judgment and backlash. And it was one of the first times that I actually felt like I was being associated with people who were Muslim, who had done things that were not positive.
mm,
And I had to, like, having nothing actually in common with them, but I felt like I had to denounce their actions in a way that people around me didn't have to do simply because of my name or the background that I was born into. So that's come back to me quite a lot over the last 20, 30 years, and just thinking a lot about voice and about who gets to speak and who has to step in. I've been thinking obviously a lot about the conflict right now and how people who connect more with Palestinians or Israelis are being asked to defend a position in a way
mhm,
that everybody
mhm,
else isn't being asked to do, and just the extra burden and weight that so many people are carrying at the moment, when people are simply trying to survive, their own families might be falling apart. And so that extra responsibility and pressure is can be quite intense. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the invitation to share a little bit about who I am. I should also mention professionally, I am the CEO of Vantage Point, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the capacity development of nonprofits across BC. And we're very grateful to be in partnership with the Inclusion Project. So thanks again. Looking forward to the conversation.
Sarah, thank you so, so much. But I just feel really blessed for the quality of stories, of experiences that we invite and welcome in this space. Thank you very much for opening like that. Next, I'll go to Yabome. Yabome, please, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks for having me, and good to be with you in community as always. Also, Zahra and Shobna. It's good to be here. It's good to be in this conversation on this day as we commemorate human rights globally. And so, to start with who I am is I will start with as I am a mother. I am a partner, a spouse, a wife to Arilana Gilpin-Jackson, a mother to Kayla, Josiah, and Perez. I am a sister to Nima, Kadi, Abbas, Memuna, Musu, Aisata, Bodhi, and Abdul and Hassan. I am an auntie to countless numbers. I am a grandaunt to Amira Subairu. I am the daughter of Sheka Hassan Kanu and Fatmata Rauda to Kanu. I am the granddaughter of Haja Yabome Sise and Ibrahim Suri Bangura, and also the granddaughter of Hassan Ali Kanu and Hajatiti Kamar. And why all of that is important is because my rootedness is in my ancestry and my family, in the people that I call family. And that's not to say that doesn't come with its own complexities, but to acknowledge that I identify first as a member of a family and then as a member of the human community. In that community and out in the world, I am socially seen as a Black woman first. And beyond that, who I am is a woman of African descent. My people that I have just named are specifically from Sierra Leone and from predominantly the Timni peoples and some intersectionalities in between. And And why that's important to this conversation is that I have grown up moving through the world as a child of Sierra Leonean students first, and then migrants around the world, which means I was born in Germany, which also means that when my family chose, because of some concerns about how to move through the world with 6 girls and 2 boys at the time, specifically how to move through the Western world, they made a choice to return to Sierra Leone. And in that choice, I then grew up contending with, are you even Sierra Leonean? Why do you talk like that? Why do you sound like that? Where are your people really from? And so in that context, dealing with being an insider, outsider, and then leaving a context of civil war, which made me a refugee, which subjected me to border scrutinies on the continent of Africa and beyond, which subjected me to what xenophobia looks like outside of the country I call home. And then I crossed some waters, and I've had every experience from being held at airports and held by border security overnight because my Canadian papers were not trusted, to landing in Canada and being in secondary search more times than I can count, to being seen as a Black woman and therefore seen less than, for example, showing up to keynote events and being asked to serve people. And again, hands up to all the food service and essential workers out there. The issue is absolutely not the dignity of their work. The issue is the assumption that if I'm in certain spaces, I can only be there in certain capacities. And so all of these experiences call me to forums like this and spaces like this to speak up for the part that's left behind when we see people and speak to people only through the labels, the part which is our common shared humanity. And the reason why every single one of us, no matter who we are, no matter what our identities, intersectionalities, and positionalities and politics in the world is, that I believe that we all should be human rights advocates, human rights ambassadors, human rights defenders, first and foremost, because my right to be and live should never negate somebody else's right to be and live. And so that's how I arrived to this conversation. And the last thing I would say is in all of that intersectionality, something that's really important to me in my African, Canadian, both Sierra Leonean and Canadian and BC identities. I've lived in BC longer than anywhere else in the world. And so what's really important for me in that connection as well is that you noted, Ruth, in inviting us to this panel, that this marks what I like to think of the evolution of the United Nations International Day for people of African descent, which was declared from 2015 to today, and will evolve, is my hope. A decade that called for recognition, justice, and development of peoples of African descent as a unique group of people whose human rights need to be protected. I raise that because some of the recognitions that were done in Canada include the recognition of the connection between Canada and Sierra Leone. Specifically in June 2023, the Black migrations to Sierra Leone was recognized for its national historic significance to Canada. What's important about that is it recognized that it was as a result of continued hardship post-abolition, continued failed promises that had a group of Black loyalists and Maroons voluntarily elect to leave Nova Scotia and return to the continent of Africa. And they landed in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which is the capital of the city in the country that my people call home, which it's colonially Sierra Leone, but I'll leave it at that.
Oh, wow. Yabome, thank you so, so much for that. I thought it was going to be powerful. I got shocked at the same time, not at all surprised. Thank you very much for that. And, for those who have been here with us, maybe from earlier today, you see that common thread again, reflecting on Jaba's story and the idea of migration and some of the common threads there in terms of, what it means to be able to move around in spaces where we need to be having the kinds of conversations that we're having today. So thank you again for that, Yabome. And Shabna, I'll come to you, please. And I see Katrina is here. Katrina, we're just doing a quick round of introductions, but we'll go to Shabna and then we'll come to you, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Ruth. A big shout out to you, to Zahra, and everyone who's part of the TIP team for doing so much and bringing us all together. I just want to take a moment to convey my heartfelt thanks. So, to those of you who don't know me, and by the way, so amazing to see my favorite people sharing the same virtual screen here, Ruth and Zahra and Katrina and Yabome. It doesn't happen every day, so this is a special moment for me, and I'm so grateful that we can do this. So I'm the youngest of three children, uh, born to amazing parents, Subhadra and Jaya-Madhavan, and I had the good fortune of being born to this family and having a childhood that was extremely happy and where I was well taken care of. I was born in Malaysia, and I moved to India to boarding school when I was 5 years old. And at a very young age, both experienced and benefited from and was exposed to very distinctly different worldviews and cultures, coming from very different backgrounds and going to school in very different backgrounds. And I grew up in India, mainly in southern India, in states of Kerala, where my ancestry is, and moved to Mumbai for my MSW degree. And what I realized when I was a social work student, where for the first time I was confronted with many of the harsh realities of systemic issues and just what a land of contrast India can be, and the history of colonization and all of that. What hit me quite hard in my late teen years and early 20s when I was studying in Mumbai was how much harm we do unto ourselves. And what I mean by that is that often when we talk about hate, when we talk about discrimination, when we talk about bias, I am guilty of this all the time. I tend to point fingers at somebody else, tend to point fingers at an organization or a family or something that's outside of my own. What hit me quite hard when I was doing my social work degree in Mumbai as a young person was how we are often guilty of those crimes within our own families, within our own communities, within our own countries, within our own organizations. And that has been, I would say, a thought and a theme I've stayed with pretty much all my life, wherein all the work that I've done, I seem to go back to my fundamental identity, which is that of a mother, a daughter, a friend, a community partner, and ask myself, what is it that I'm doing that's within my span of control and deep within me that I can change, that I'm choosing not to change? And I just wanted to share that before I forget it. But in terms of who I am, I think I like to go with a very simple definition, which is I'm fundamentally, I think, a global, sort of a citizen who just like a sponge, likes to take in, all the good things I can learn from people from around the world, cultures from around the world, and constantly challenge myself to try and make a small difference. And love being a mother and a volunteer. And I have two beautiful sons, Prabinj and Niranj, who are 27 and 24, who constantly challenge me about the kind of world that we are in and what is it I'm doing to make a difference? And is that going to be helpful, useful, beneficial to their generation when they inherit this world that I've helped, co-create? And I'm looking forward to the conversation this morning. And thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Sobhana. Like every time we get together, I feel like I'm learning something new about you. I am learning something new, and there's quite a bit there. But first, I didn't even know you were born outside of India. But thank you so much for sharing that with us. Katrina, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us. As I mentioned before, we're just doing a quick round of introductions, so I'm going to pass the mic right to you. Please do share, however you feel inclined, a bit about your journey, who you are, what you're bringing into this space today.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for welcoming me here, and then to all of you for the opportunity to join this very meaningful event. I don't know how I follow Shabna. I've always learned so much from Shabna and her incredible journey and experiences, and very diverse experiences as well. And I think all of us here has a lot of lived and personal experiences when it comes to how do we make our community a better and more welcoming space where everybody could belong. So I also came here as a settler, an immigrant from Taiwan. I grew up in Taiwan, and I came here when I was 17 to the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and just really grateful despite the journey that sometimes can be very challenging, but I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be able to build my life here, to raise my son. I'm a proud mom of a 10-year-old, very active boy. And many of you may know me from my past career, and actually I've been in the political world for about 18 years after I graduated from SFU and decided to settle here in Canada. And I had the honor of serving as a school trustee in Burnaby, then becoming the MLA for Burnaby Lougheed, and also served as the Minister of State for Childcare that had the great honor to work on the Childcare BC plan. And I know today we're going to talk a lot about, how can we make our community more welcoming? And I'm just forever grateful through my personal lived experiences. And now to my new journey, as you can see, I'm calling in from my work. I now work for a community savings credit union, and we just started the first credit union brand dedicated to serving Chinese language communities here. So I'm honored to serve as the president to work on this new project. And then I am also a certified coach. And next year, I will have my first children's book coming out, as I have been really public about my journey as a survivor of gender-based violence. And I know today is the International Human Rights Day, that we're going to focus on human rights. And at the same time, it is also the end of the 16 days of action against gender-based violence. And I know many of you, I see a lot of nods, that are advocate and activists advocating for the rights of women and individuals who have struggled with violence. And as a survivor myself, I kind of put together some personal experiences and also other people's story into a children's book that's advocating and raising more awareness about the impact of family violence and the generational trauma that it can create. So today, I'm really excited to join this conversation. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to learn from all of you and learning together. And I do believe, after my years working in politics and have seen some of the changes that we can bring, that by working together and when there is a will, there is a way that we can bring more positive changes to people and everyone in our community to make this a way more welcoming space for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I hear you, and I hear from everyone on the panel today, on our invisible table, around our invisible table. And I think the only thing that's missing here today is time in abundance. We're going to try to do as much as we can. We're going to try to cheat time, try to cheat everything, and make this as meaningful as it can be. Just hearing your stories, hearing your journeys, hearing the experiences that have led each and every one of you to the many ways you continue to contribute and show leadership in community. I think that in itself there just is a lot in there. And thank you again for sharing that with us. So I'm going to try to get through. I have outlined a few questions here. But at the same time, I want this to take the shape of water, so we'll follow it where it goes. But Yabom, when you were speaking earlier, you talked about some of your aspirations, I guess, for lack of a better word there, for the International Decade for People of African Descent. How, yes, it's coming to a to a calendar end at this time, but there seems to be some, some hope that you have that if anything, this is not just an end, but a turning of the page in some sense. What do you think? If that were to be the case, what do you think as a society we can do to better position ourselves for something as transformative as this, something that gives opportunity for people of African descent, for their voices to be heard, for their visibility to be seen within community?
Mhm. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant question, and I'll jump right in where I left off, which is, and I did put the link in chat in terms of some of what Canada did over the decade, as it was designated by the United Nations. What I love about the frameworks that the UN has brought to us is this extra impetus to put the way behind the wheel, as Katrina just said, to have countries, nations, and jurisdictions at all levels look at what they can do to align with certain recognitions. What I would be concerned with is that with the calendar date ending, that we don't see a rollback of some of what has been done, or B, that the momentum ceases. So, for example, I posted some of Canada's recognitions, including historical sites. But what is also true today is that some of the commitments to restore those sites and to restore those communities have still not been fulfilled. Coast to coast across the country, whether we're talking, Africville to Hogan's Alley here in BC. So what does it look like, not just to have done the recognition bit, but to also do the justice and the development bit, which was the three themes of the decade. And I'm not by any chance, I'm not privy to all the things that have occurred. And I've been in many spaces, many dialogues. I've seen some of the changes at community levels, some of the funding at community levels. So I hope everyone here hears me and hears this comment not as a critique of what has been done, but as a call to continued action. Where those journeys have fallen short of the promises, to continue the momentum to see those promises fulfilled, and B, where issues have not been addressed. And we know, I mean, I can go down the list, everything from whether it's actual justice in terms of law enforcement and what that looks for our population, our Black population in Canada, who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, despite our percentage of population, whether that looks like economic outcomes, whether that looks like health equity. Katrina, you mentioned generational trauma. That is true in Black communities and Indigenous communities. I want to bring in our Indigenous communities here. Indigenous and Black communities are at the bottom of the bottom in some of these metrics. And this is not oppression Olympics, it's facts. I can pull up any number of facts while we're on this call, from Stats Canada through the health system, that points to these facts, right? And so how do we turn these statistics around? How do we have economic justice for these communities who are experiencing relative impoverishment that has to do with generational outcomes? I mentioned historically being from Sierra Leone. On one side of my family, I'm Indigenous Sierra Leonean. My first name is Yabo. It is a very Timni name that means wise elder woman. My last name is Gilpin-Jackson. It is a name inherited from slave descent, from the populations of Africans that were enslaved and that lost their name, were given new names, and over the generations now have kept those names because they have no other names to go back to. And so I am married into a family, and my children are part Creole and part Timni. So what does that mean for them in that society and beyond? And what does it mean for this generation where Black communities, but specifically those that experienced enslavement and colonization and neocolonization and the conflicts that are happening, have happened historically and continue to happen. Congo has been in the conversation right now, along with some of the other areas of global conflict right now, and the continued resource extraction and displacement and armed conflict and wars that happen in regions that has to do with extraction and global inequity. So then you have our communities disproportionately economically disadvantaged. What are we doing to continue to right that? I love hearing about initiatives like a credit union for Chinese language speaking groups. I know there's other communities that are doing work like that. We have an onus in our communities, and I'm really proud of some of the work that has been happening in BC by various friends and colleagues, and looking at economic justice and supporting Black businesses and Black entrepreneurs. And I hope that not just our communities, but globally and all of us here, because all of us are in this conversation, if we lift those that are most marginalized, we lift everybody. So what does it look like to support particularly Black communities, African descent communities, and continue the momentum of the decade that we've just had, and complete the cycle of recognition, justice, and development, so that we get to a place of equity into the future. We're not there yet.
Continuing a cycle of justice. And as we all know, this is truly a journey. It's a continuous process, and it's not a destination that we're necessarily trying to arrive at. Thank you very much for that, Yabome. Zahra, I'll come back to you. I know when you did your introduction earlier, you were talking about how you felt the need to kind of justify your presence, your identity in some ways. And I know that you have extensive experience in conflict resolution and peace building. A lot of that expertise you bring to your current work at Vantage Point. What strategies, in your opinion, can we adopt to foster meaningful dialogue between communities where deep-seated tensions exist?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. That's a huge question. On a very personal level, this isn't a very sophisticated answer, but I think on a very personal level, so many of us, given the biases that we're raised with or that we start to build by watching media, or there's so many reasons for which biases are created, but I think that a basic curiosity about people instead of making assumptions, having a little bit of curiosity, and oftentimes that's learning how to catch ourselves when we are getting into those assumptions. It's just to say, hold on, why am I assuming this about somebody or a community? And what can I do to sort of back up a little bit and approach the situation or the individual with curiosity first? Because usually through curiosity, we can build understanding. Again, I know that that's not a very sophisticated response, but I honestly feel like if more of us can tap into that, instead of jumping to judgment, just asking questions and trying to understand, instead of assuming, it can help us open the door for more dialogue. And for me, actually, this is a really interesting, just hearing everybody who's spoken. I had a lot of international experience in my early career. I had a big stint doing international development work early on. And I think that, from my time living in India and the example that I just gave of, the conflict in the Middle East right now, the world really likes, I'm going to generalize, but I think that the world really likes to pit people against each other. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. I often felt when I was in India that Muslims and Hindus were being pitted against each other. I feel now globally, Muslims and Jews are being pitted against each other. And my own personal way of trying to deal with the conflict and the crisis in Palestine and Israel right now is to seek out, genuinely seek out members of the Jewish community that I can be in close relationship with. I know that there is a very easy narrative to give into where we can just talk about each other and let that gap widen and widen and widen. My own personal way of trying to bridge that is to be that bridge. to find people where we can talk about our shared values, our shared focus on humanity and connection, and build relationships one at a time, so that we can not let different situations break us apart, but rather we can be strong, we can be courageous, we can do what's really uncomfortable sometimes, but find those ways to stay together. And I don't remember who it was, because this is not a popular choice. It is much more popular to stick to the polls and further that rhetoric. But somebody told me, and I know you and I have talked about this phrase, but if you build a bridge, you will be stepped on, right? So having that in my mind and knowing that if many of us are going to take this effort to try to remain in communication and in community with each other, even when the world is trying to push us apart, we will get pushback for that. And to expect some of that pushback and be strong in our resolve to want to remain in connection and community instead of letting those forces kind of judge us and cause that harm that can make it tempting to stay away from each other. So I'm not sure if that was a good response to your question, Ruth, but that's yeah, just on a personal level. And then at the organization that I work for with nonprofits, because even nonprofits, and we're trying to build a provincial network, and there's so much diversity within the community of nonprofits. And so really thinking about the work we can engage in together and what we do have in common instead of always fixating on our differences. So I'll leave it there.
Zahra, I'm going to answer your question. Unfortunately, it wasn't a good enough response. It was a much, much better response. The way you opened, and in typical Zahra fashion, very humble, very unassuming. The way you opened there about this is going to be basic. I think at the end of the day, that's what we need to come back to. The very basics. We had a conversation like this a month ago, and we had Sobhana and Sandia. And what the key takeaway from that conversation was about how, yes, we can have all the big D data things and big statistics and metrics, but at the end of the day, it's about people. Big P, small p people. It's coming back to the basics. So thank you very much for that, Zahra. Katrina, I'll come to you, reflecting on your experience in government. So Zahra talked about, these day-to-day interactions. What she shared there, I thought was truly powerful, truly remarkable about what I'm doing to combat this is actually seek out people on what's supposed to be the other side and hear from the other side. Now, one of the documentary we saw earlier, we were looking at the role of government, and there seems to be some sentiment about the fact that not too much is being done by government. And I know this is a past life for you, but of course, we are every version of where we've been and what we've done. So I'm going to push that button to you and ask you, what role should policymakers play in addressing the rise in hate crimes and systemic discrimination? What tangible actions can government take to ensure accountability and change?
I think government definitely has a huge and a critical position and an obligation to work on this, especially to look at the roots of all the causes, right? Do we have enough public awareness about hate crime and discrimination and all the inequities that we have in our world? Are we properly funding public education or childcare and children and families who are struggling with systemic challenges and generational trauma? Are we doing enough, through our public system, healthcare, education, and even infrastructures, and looking at the government institutions? Do we have enough lived experiences in government? That's the one question I also continue to ask. I remember when I first got elected to the provincial government in 2017, and I had a visit to the ministry where I belong, and I was, pretty, privileged and honored to have the opportunity to get into cabinet right away. But everywhere I go in government, I just feel that there's a lack of diverse lived experiences. And I don't think there's a lot of people in government that really understand those generational and systemic challenges and impacts that's happening to our current families and again. And we haven't really spent enough time and resources. I think there has been time spent, but just really not enough investment into this area. So I think we really need to fundamentally change the narrative about how government looks at anti-racism, hate crime, and the challenges we're facing. And that also connect to other problems we're seeing in our community: public safety, mental health, the well-being of our children and families. So I think the work has to be so fundamental. But the challenge I also noticed with government is because with the election cycle, it's every 4 years, and politicians, and I understand, right? I've been there myself. You're always looking at what can I do the fastest to see some result. But when you're really investing at fundamental challenges and the root causes of things, that could take a long time, right? Investing in better support for families, that could take 5 to 10 years or more to see that generational changes. So I do hope that politicians can always have a view. Like, for example, when I worked on the Childcare BC plan, the $10 a day plan, that actually was driven by the community and then adopted by the government, and actually was by mostly a strong, courageous group of women who has been fighting for this for generations. I remember how things could actually be done when you have good politicians like the finance minister at the time, Carol James, who is another woman who I truly admire, who had the courage to say, let's fund this, let's get this done, and let's make a 10-year plan to get this done. So I do hope politicians will always have that courage to think outside of the box, to think about long-term investments that we can make. And I believe that can really help with a lot of systemic challenges that we're seeing right now.
Thanks a lot for that, Katrina. Thank you. Shobhana, I have a two-pronged question for you, but I'll start with I'll start from the very beginning. Every time I think on how when we get together, we're chatting formally, informally, or whatever it is, I can count on my first hand here the number of times. I can't. English fails me, and this is where you would know who my kith and kin are. Shobhana, I just want to reflect on, first of all, I know where your heart lies in terms of your relationship with your children. And from time to time, you talk about harnessing the power of youth. One of my questions is about, your work in post-secondary, the decades of experience that you bring both from here in Canada and back in India, but also looking at how intergenerational learning opportunities can contribute to building inclusive communities. What role do you see the younger generation play in shaping the more inclusive future, hate-free future that we're talking about?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Anything to do with youth is near and dear to my heart. So thank you for the question. I truly appreciate it. I just want to go back in time. So I'm 57 years old. And when I was 16, so almost 40 years there, by accident, I became the president of the Rotaract Club in my little town called Palakkad in Kerala in southern India. And I say by accident because I joined this club because I was so bored and I was such a nuisance that my parents said, for God's sake, find a club and entertain yourself. And I went looking, and this was the club that I came across. And little did I know that it was a community service club. And being an absolutely pampered, well taken care of, middle class child in India, I was completely ignorant about the harsh realities surrounding me. Joining this club, starting to work in an orphanage, and then getting out in the community when I was 16, 17, fundamentally changed me as a person and the trajectory of my life. And I start with that point because when I now look 40 years, from that point in time, one of the few things that saddens me terribly is how we continue to silence the youth voice. And what I mean by that is, irrespective of how we have progressed as a society, whether we like it or not, we all still love well-behaved children. The ones that don't roll on the floor of grocery stores and kick up a storm because they didn't get their favorite candy. The ones who sit with their legs properly crossed and come back home with their school uniforms still white, with no mud on them. Lot of families, lot of parents, whether they want to publicly admit it or not, will say, thank God my child is not like yours that goes in a white shirt and comes back in a brown one, or the child who in a family dinner, stands up and say, I think that was the silliest idea I've ever heard, and blurt it out to an adult in the room, right? So I want to just contextualize what I'm going to say next. All of this so-called parenting that we try and do with the majority of children world over, that actually goes beyond our dining tables, and beyond our homes. As a society, right? Whether it's in a bus, whether it's in public transit, whether it's in a university, whether it's in in front of a museum where a protest is happening. As a society, we get scared when people speak up, right? We like to immediately label a group that breaks the silence as troublemakers or activists. Look at the labels we have for people of any gender who speak up, who challenge status quo, right? Who write a petition, who on social media call out a politician or a policymaker or a celebrity for saying or doing something. Immediately we try to cancel them out. So now going back to your question, right? How we, involving youth, and how are we making sure the youth voice is heard? I will say, and I want to be provocative because this platform is a safe one. I would say that we remain confused and we remain on the fence when it comes to involving youth. On one hand, we want them to be change makers. We want them to be part of the revolution to make the world a better place. But on the other hand, we are uncomfortable in giving up power. And there is only so much power to share. And if we want to empower youth, adults have to give up power. If there is only one glass of water and there's 5 of us, we better be willing to share that and just take few sips, right? But if I want to drink it all down, well, there's very little left for the rest of you. That's just plain math if you talk about it, right? So I feel that as a society, whether it's EDI work, whether it is, entrepreneurship, whether it is youth leadership, no matter what it is, at the end of the day, if we don't dismantle power, then people who should have a voice and should have a platform often get silenced or get pushed off it even before they're finished their sentence. And we've talked about acknowledgements today, to go beyond acknowledgements. Jamba and his powerful, conversation with us virtually shared that with us. We continue to do that every single day in our organizations, in our different places. We bring indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers. And generally, do we see them for the remaining 3 hours? No, we don't. Right? We continue to do this because we feel we've done something and something is better than nothing. So I want to just wrap this thought process of mine by saying that honestly, we need to stop wasting time. Our time and the time of the young people. We either want to be truly inclusive or we should have the courage to say, you know what? I don't like giving up my power, and it's going to take some time before I share a full chair, a full table, and a full boardroom and a full stage with you. I'm going to stop right there.
Shabna, you said you were going to be provocative and you lived up to it. Thank you for that challenge there, for the need to step away from performative justice. I think it was Jabba who was sharing earlier and talking about for justice to be real, for it to be lasting, it's got to be restorative, not performative. Thank you for reminding us of that. As I mentioned, this was a two-part question. So here's the second P coming out of that pod. I know you're passionate about how institutions are run as well. So in thinking about institutions, whether it's educational, looking at your most recent experience and your current experience, or even going further down memory lane, policy making institutions, government agencies, what kind of a role can they play in being an active tool, a driving force to address and combat systemic discrimination, where we're not just at a gathering like this talking about small p policy issues or small I issues within communities, but in those offices, it doesn't quite land. What kind of a role can institutions like this play?
I mean, a horrendously large role, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of the institutions that you just touched on, Ruth, are remnants of colonization, right? Whether it's a bank, whether it's a school, you know, whether it's a, authority to take care of our utilities, doesn't matter. Any large institution, right, in modern day society, generally has been shaped and molded by colonialism, in one way or the other, right? And it's very difficult to turn into something else, right? And educational institutions around the world have struggled with it. I mean, the reason why across Canada, we have such a big push for EDI and reconciliation work is because of the acknowledgement that we are products of colonization, right? And it is not easy to dismantle that, to decolonize. It is not easy because on one hand, the hand that feeds you, the hand that funds you, want things done a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have that funding and those resources, well, then we might all as well go home.
Mm-hmm.
So, on one hand, you have no choice. Like if you're a public funded institution in Canada, you have no choice but to take government funding
Mm-hmm.
or funding from another source. But the moment you take funding, right, whether it's for a student seat or whether it's for research purposes, the moment you take funding, you are signing on a dotted line that basically is a contract that says, thou shalt do the following 9 things if you want to continue to have this funding. And thou shalt report out every quarterly using this template if you want to continue with this funding. And then, of course, there will be a little bit in there that says, thou shalt be committed to reconciliation and EDI work, by the way. But the problem is that, right, trying to force these things to coexist, right? So you can pay an honorarium, say, to an indigenous knowledge keeper, but you cannot give them a full-time job because they don't have a master's or an undergraduate or a PhD, right? So we have, as a society, done a fantastic job in putting things together that will always struggle to coexist. And I would say, with great respect for everybody, this is pretty deliberate. In the last conversation you had, in response to your question, you might remember, Ruth, I said, why is it is still a case in a place like Canada that less than 10% of women are, say, in CXO level? Is it because we have a lack of educated women? No. Is it because we have a lack of women who want to be career women and do a fantastic job of contributing to society? No. We have less than 10% of women in CXO or in senior leadership simply because it is so difficult to get up in the morning and do all the things you're expected to do as a mother for young children and then dash off to work and be in a boardroom at 8:25 looking all well put together to make your next presentation, right? So society on one hand will give you that freedom, will give you access to education, and on the other hand make it so difficult to show up early like a man or like anybody else as an equal, right? So those are the harsh realities that we are part of. So what can institutions do? Well, I think institutions can commit themselves to solidarity. United we stand, divided we fall. I think that is so still true in modern day society. It is difficult for one institution, one EDI leader to stand up and call out problematic policies and practices. But what if 100 signed one letter and said, we respectfully would like to let you know, if you want us to commit to reconciliation in EDI and have a more inclusive student population, faculty and staff population, then the following 5 things you want us to do as part of your funding requirements, it's not going to be doable. If 100 people said that, right, then nobody gets into trouble and nobody single-handedly will get singled out. So I feel that whether it's EDI, whether it's university, education, whether it's immigration policy, whatever be the case, we are still being divided and ruled. And as long as we allow for that to continue, and we don't have solidarity across the board on basic human rights, it will take another 100 years before we can see meaningful change. Stop at
100 years is a very long time indeed. Thank you very much for that really powerful insight, Shobana. And Shobana, as you were talking about and those intersecting identities, and particularly what it means to be a woman navigating these spaces. I'm reminded by my child who has not started university as yet, despite our very best effort, who's just crying in the background here and trying to let me know that she matters and she needs to be part of these conversations. Yabome, I'll shift gears here. And, I think about whenever I have shared space with you or followed your work even from a distance, something that's really unmistakable is your leadership, and I think that's informed by, you took us through a snapshot earlier, all of the experiences that you've had, the ones that your ancestors have shared with you as well. And I think of the notion of transformative leadership, and I'm wondering to you what that looks like in this fight against hate and discrimination.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. And I think a good place to continue off a few threads from Shobana. Thank you for everything you said there. And I think in a lot of ways, for me, thinking about how I lead is the other side of that coin in terms of how we're going to change these intractable systems and structures. And I think that are based on colonial heritages, as Shobana said, and the sober realities, like, it's going to take 100 years to get here. So I'm going to start right there with that comment and backtrack 100 years. We are here because of the work that leaders and communities and people who were not afraid to keep going, and because of their efforts, we are here. This circle of people on this screen would not have had this privilege to be on a screen like this, having this conversation 100 years ago. No way, no how. All of us here probably had opportunities to vote recently. We would not have been able to do that if women and community members and advocates and activists and leaders in organizations did not keep going. So when we hear that sober reality, and I often describe myself as a realist, not a pessimist, not too much of an optimist, a realist, it is in the context of, again, looking at the facts, and I don't mean data in the colonial sense, the facts, the narrative, the story, the journey. 100 years seems far away, but it is not that far. It's our grandchildren, for those of us who have children, and if they do have children. And so that generational thinking has to be with us now in order for us to be able to lead. And I come a lot from that place. I feel really lucky and that I have been able to, over my career, be in and out of broadly community organizing spaces, human development, broadly spaces, locally and internationally, as well as organizational, institutional systems change, transformational change spaces. And so to your point, and I write and talk a lot about transformational leadership and transformative learning. I really identify with those principles. And the reason for that for me is because transformational leadership is inside out as much as it's outside in. It's both about how I show up and how I do the very things I'm calling people to do. As well as how I then influence and support people to do things that are transformative, right? Transformational leadership is about how you influence people. It's simplistic, but it's about how you influence people through your example. As we said earlier, some of these things are simple, so let's just keep it like that. It's how you influence people through the example of how you show up. And if I'm able to think about this is complex, but what's the one thing I can do that will make a difference? And if people see me doing that, then when I ask you, what's the one thing you can do with all of the complexity that you just described, the way this grant is not going to work because of these 5 things that they've put in the text that counter the end of what we're trying to achieve. That is all true. What is the thing we can do to make a difference? I'll give you some concrete examples at this point. I was in healthcare for 10 years before I went to a Crown and then came over to post-secondary as well, and served with Sobhana at SFU, and Katrina, I know you're an alumni. In my healthcare days, we were starting to see the systemic challenges ahead of us with public health, with emergency rooms, with primary care, and there was a lot going on with sort of health, human resources, etc. I happened to be in a health leadership role and in a role that helps lead with that led the team around leading change when we got some government directions around fundamental changes, some of which we're now living through and going through in terms of strengthening our primary care network and things like that. But the very first mandates kind of came out like the way we're seeing our immigration changes coming out right now, like bam, and made no sense systemically in terms of how we could physically do them. Like, again, not criticizing the end of what was trying to be accomplished, but we need a plan for transforming and you implementing this network in a month, right? Turmoil in the system. Everybody's like, it's impossible. We can't do it. And we're going on and on. So I walked into this room and I'm having a physical memory of this as I speak. I walked into this room where I was asked, a number of leaders were asked to assemble right away to figure out how we were going to respond to this. I walk into the room and the tension, I'm walking through a wall of stress. Like the tension was palpable. It was doomsday, like nobody, they were like, this is impossible. And you had everything from people worrying about losing their jobs to people worrying about the systemic impact. It felt like a no-win. And so we're hearing from everybody in terms of the challenges. And I'm listening and I just pause the conversation and ask the question I just asked. What's the one thing we can do right now to find our way forward? I'm like, okay, no. What's the one thing we can do to find out where? Okay, it's impossible, even the timeline, we can't do it in a month. And I said, has anybody asked if the month is negotiable? Silence. Silence. All the way up to the CEO in the room in that moment. Oh, no, they'll never do it. I'm like, okay, that's our assumption. Has anybody asked if we can get more than a month? What would be reasonable? We need at least 3 months. Okay, we might not get 3 months, but has anybody asked Is the timeline negotiable? So we left that room, I kid you not, where the single action was, here are the 3 people we're going to nominate. I was one of the 3 to get on a call with various ministry folks to say, these are the core challenges you need to know. For us to go from A to B, we need more time. What was the outcome? We got more time. We didn't get 6 months or 3 months, but we got more time. And we were able to provide a reasonable response to start the road to transformation. So I say that to say, part of what we need to know to be transformational is to understand that sometimes the one thing we need to do is the smallest thing. It's the smallest policy tweak. It's the smallest procedure tweak. Yes, the system is impossible, but it's all these tweaks. It's all these changes. It's all have we thought about this differently? Those are the things that create transformation in the end. At any point in time, these systems will not turn around all at once, but we are not in the same system we were in 100 years ago. And by Jove, I hope that we're willing to do the transformative tweaks or the huge transformative changes if we have that access and privilege, so that 100 years from now, our universities are not the ones we're in now. Our institutions, our schools, our governments are different in terms of who's represented, in terms of who's thought of, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you another tiny example. This is a policy example. I'm sitting in a leadership role. Somebody comes and says, I have this case, this person is challenging that we, I won't go into the details for confidentiality, but we haven't paid a certain fee on the continuum of immigration supports, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, but why don't we? Oh, we don't know. Okay, why don't we? Where is the policy? Where's the procedure? Oh, it's just how we do it. And then I looked at the situation and I was like, okay, do we understand that the only people that get asked to pay this fee are people from the so-called global south? Do we understand that in terms of global inequities, not individuals, not families, etc., whatever, but in terms of global inequities, these are the parts of the world that experience the most economic hardship for global reasons, for the reasons we all enjoy, including our cell phones. Yes, okay. So why are we not paying this fee for these people that are systemically targeted and disadvantaged by this fee? The fee that could be the difference between them getting here to serve our system and not. But we're not paying it, but everybody else doesn't get asked to pay this fee and have an easier time coming in. Do we understand that this is how we reinforce systemic inequities? Silence. Because again, nobody had asked the questions. It was one small tweak. I then asked for that tweak to be changed for everybody future forward. And for me, those are the examples of the biggest transformative things I have done and will continue to do in my leadership, simply because I'm willing to provide that critical analysis or the equity analysis or the whatever, even in stuck systems. And that for me is the call to transformational leadership. It's just thinking differently, being differently, and showing up differently.
Yabome, I really appreciate how you've brought us once again back to the basics, understanding that it's in those seemingly simple questions, in those seemingly simple conversations. Thank you very much for that. Zahra, I want to talk about community resilience. Earlier on, I talked about your work in peace building, and you mentioned how you've now brought that work to the leadership that you bring to your work in community now. But in building this resilience, because I also think very often any corner of the world, I'm really privileged to be on a daily basis working with people who bring experience from different parts of the world. What that also means, and we talk about pluralism and Canada being a bedrock for that, knowing that, people have multiple identities and you can't separate. In many instances, I am not just Canadian. As a matter of fact, I'm not just even African. In thinking about some of the relationships, some of the places that I get to be and step into now, there are these intersecting, sometimes even often conflicting and conflating aspects of our identities. Now, how do we mesh all of this? How do we bring all of that to bear in building community communities that are truly resilient, that are truly collaborative in the approaches they take to addressing big issues, small issues.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm reminded of a story that maybe I'll start with and then answer the question a little bit more clearly. But I know when I was growing up as a Canadian-born child of immigrants and as a racialized person in Calgary, you know, from time to time I experienced oppression or discrimination, but there wasn't really a lot of space for dialogue. And so these became moments of shame, where I was feeling kind of like, okay, I'm supposed to be somebody different. I don't quite fit. I can't do what other kids do. Um, and when my daughter, who I have a 10-year-old daughter, I forgot to mention her in my intro, her name's Zahra. And she's a very strong little girl, growing so quickly. She's 10 now. But when she was in grade 1, she experienced her first kind of blatant experience of racism, where one little girl told a friend of theirs that she doesn't like Zahra because she doesn't like brown and black people. So that, of course, came back to my daughter, and she's a little 1-year-old, or first grader rather. She was about 6. Didn't really understand what to do with that, but knew that it was hurtful. So one of the things that, we talked to her about it. I'm grateful that she told us that this is something that she had experienced. And then we had a conversation, and I really was able to ask her what she wanted to do and if she wanted to talk to her teacher. I didn't try not to make those decisions for her, but ultimately she said, yeah, can you please email my teacher? And so we did. And thankfully, we're talking about institutions, right? And the opportunities that different larger institutions have to create change and create difference. Well, this school that she goes to has been doing a lot of education and training and thinking and doing around how to create more inclusive spaces. And so the teacher, when she heard this, thankfully was a very motivated and active person, and she took it very seriously. The principal took it very seriously, and they were able to do some things that created this moment that could have, and if I was her, if this was in the 80s, it would have been something that created shame. Instead, they went around, she's in French immersion, so they went around, the teacher read a book in French called, it's the translation of I Love Myself. And then all the children got to say something that they love about themselves. That was my little girl's opportunity to stand up and say, I love my brown skin. So this was a really, really powerful thing that actually kind of makes me feel a little teary when I think about it, because it was an opportunity that this institution had that could reinforce the resiliency that she has from a 6-year-old child's age, right? And so that has stayed with her. And so coming back to a previous question that you asked, these large, important institutions do have a lot of opportunity to embed teaching and awareness into the way that they interact with their employees and all of the people that they come into contact with. And I often think, as I mentioned before, I'm fully rooted in the nonprofit sector, and I think about how much privilege I have in that I've been able to learn from Indigenous community members and elders. I've been able to take trainings with, the Inclusion Project. We were able to do an equity audit. We've been able to do so much learning. And I think that that's mirrored in some academic institutions and in some financial institutions, like Van City might be a champion. Katrina, I'm sure Community Savings will be a champion, but it's not something that your average person, your average Canadian or BC resident actually even has access to. My sisters are both lawyers. How much exposure do they have to the spaces where they can lean into that curiosity that I mentioned before and be able to learn about people who are different from them, and so some of these barriers that keep us disconnected from each other, and some experiencing more oppression than others. So I do think that part of the building of resiliency can come from institutions making these courageous choices to help people challenge the thinking that they might have grown up with and expose people to new ideas. And then, we are at Vantage Point in the early stages of building a provincial network for nonprofits. We're learning a lot from Ontario Nonprofit Network. And the nonprofit sector as a sector has been less privileged than a lot of others, right? It's never been as powerful. We often are at the receiving end of decision making and policy setting. And we employ a disproportionate percentage of women and people from racialized or newcomer backgrounds as well. So for me, the equity issues are baked right into the nonprofit sector. And what we're trying to do with this network is lean into research and lean into connection between diverse nonprofits that often are divided against each other. Again, divide and conquer is my whole theme for everything these days. But, we can, if we learn to come together as this kind of underprivileged sector, we can tap into a strength in our shared voice that can start to allow us to influence what those systems look like instead of just being on the receiving end of them. So I use this as an example of what I think movement making can be. And everything that I've heard from the mentors that we have from other networks and other movement makers is that we need to move at the speed of trust. And we really need to tap into those relationships that have to be included so that we can fall back on trust with each other to do brave things and to do change making, because it is not easy. It's often upsetting because we are changing things. We're trying to change things. And so we can navigate those changes much more effectively if we trust each other and if we know how to lean into some conflict and tension, as opposed to feeling uncomfortable and just staying away from each other, which is what we're more likely to do if we don't have trust. So I personally feel like that example relates very much to human beings working on not just nonprofit equity and empowerment, but general human rights and social justice initiatives. How does the Black community tap into its power? It's largely most likely through strong relationships and figuring out where it can unify so that that voice can be strong. The same thing with the 2S LGBTQ community or a variety of other communities that are not getting their that are not necessarily experiencing equity yet. How do they find their voice? And I think that is through unity, connection, and community and movement making. So that's where I have hope, and that's where I see progress potentially coming in the future. And again, staying unified and not letting the differences really come in the way so that the voice gets very diluted, because I think that often happens.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's not about us versus them. And that's what we continue to see. You were saying divide and conquer. That seems to be the running theme. And I think very often it's easy for us to know it at a very at a we know it, we have it at the backs of our minds, but in actuality, it's not always the case that we're able to call it out or to point it out or to say, here is how we circumvent or actively navigate this in such a way as benefits all of us. Thank you very much for that, Zahra. Katrina, I'll come to you, and then in our next round, we'll be wrapping things up. I mean, looking at what's behind you now, that's a very, really, really beautiful logo, I have to say. And earlier when you were reflecting on your time in government, you talked about the policy that you'd done, and I appreciated the fact that you weren't just talking about it through the lens of government. You were talking about all of the input and contributions that you got from there. I think it's critically important. It becomes apparent through the course of our work how critically important it is to have collaboration between community and other players, whether it's the government, even the private sector, which some may argue we don't have as much representation of when we have conversations like this. Now, how do you see that form of collaboration playing out, whether it's government with grassroots community organizations, with between policymakers and people in the private sector who once again relate with community? What forms of collaboration do you think are needful for us to create sustainable change?
Thank you so much. And I'm just so empowered by everything that has been shared by Zahra, Sobhana, and Yabome as well. And thank you, Ruth, for doing such a great job moderating this conversation. And I do think that there's so many opportunity, like we all have different lived experiences and different stories, but we're all coming together with the common ground. And I feel like sometimes it's easy to talk about the common ground, but in reality, human nature, we always feel like there's so little space and we all have to take some space, and and there's so much ego and competition that happens. And I was actually listening to a podcast about, human just naturally likes to, we're more drawn to conflict, right? Instead of working together. We like drama rather than just harmony. And I think it's okay to recognize that. Right? I think it's okay to kind of be aware of that. Like I have moments where I feel like I want to compete too, especially after years in politics, right? I'm equally guilty sometimes that I feel like I have to take the space. I need to make sure I occupy the space. But over the years, I also learned that the world is huge. Our world is really how we perceive it to be. Sometimes I think as humans, we're so focused on this one thing that's in front of us, but then there's so much that's around us that we're not really seeing. So I think it's so important to kind of sometimes, in a Chinese saying that we say, take a step back and you'll see the whole world. And again, it's easy to say, but sometimes that step back is so hard because we're so leaning to moving forward instead of backward, right? Walking backward is uncomfortable. So I think it's just a reminder. And again, I think that comes really from strong awareness. Like even for me, as a woman of color, as an immigrant who came here on my own, it took me a long time to realize, right, what are some of my barriers? What are some of the things that I'm not seeing? And I think just, this is why I appreciate Sobhana and all of you so much, that I feel like we're always constantly learning. We have to constantly encourage us to learn and to be aware. But in terms of finding common ground, I think it's to create a dialogue. I understand it is never possible to create a totally safe environment. When we say, we want to create a safe space, but how do we know each other's experiences? I don't know everything about you, even as your closest friends, sometimes you're still learning about your friends. So we don't know your triggers, but we at least do our best to create a safe environment when we're having this dialogue. And then we're mindful and with good intentions. And I have some good examples actually from the childcare work that our government did, and I was honored to lead that work for a few years. That in the beginning, when we said let's create a public childcare sector, and that's invest publicly into childcare, that's create more community spaces, long-term assets for childcare, and that sounds great. But a lot of women who have started a childcare business, whether from their home or a private investment, because government was doing nothing about childcare for years, they got so scared of this message. They're like, we don't want this. We don't want public investment. Don't touch my business, right? Don't touch this, don't touch that. And I had many, many hard conversations when I traveled across the province to try to build that collaboration. And also, I also noticed that the childcare sector is predominantly women. There's a lot of equity lens into that too. So every conversation I had, I think what I was trying to learn is that, okay, I'm going to do my best to learn from you, understanding where you're coming from. Why do you have this resistance? And then we look for the common ground. We always talk about, well, our focus is on the children and families we serve. Don't we want them to all have affordable, accessible, quality childcare? And everybody agrees. But of course, we all have different business models, right? Some nonprofit, there's indigenous, there's government owned, there's privately owned, even family childcare. There's so many different ways of funding that. But we all have the same goal. So I think it's through that dialogue and that continued conversation that we focus on the common goal. It was interesting that, after a few years, and just actually last year, after I actually stepped away from the role, I went to this childcare conference and I saw this woman who was the most vocal. If you Google the news, her name will come up, and who the most vocal against $10 a day childcare and government investment. She actually joined a $10 a day childcare event. She said, over the years, I just realized, and she still owns a private business, and she actually started a nonprofit. And that was the moment I feel like collaboration can happen, even if you come from totally different places. But if you have the same vision right here, it's just a different journey. But we all support each other to go towards that vision, which is creating a more equitable society for all. And every time even I talk to some of my friends who are like, I'm voting for, the right wings or the conservatives. I'm like, but don't you all share the same goal? You know, we all want our kids to have a safe community, good neighbors, good schools to go to. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, but then why are we focused on extreme politics, right? Why are we fighting against each other when we all have the same goal? And I think that's the dialogue, and that's why public education is so critical to transform our world through a more equitable start and conversations that have to happen. And I love Zahra's story about her daughter. I learned so much from my son as well, that every day, right, they bring back stories about their interactions and how do we shape those little minds. And then also through our children, actually bring back good information to their families and their parents. So thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity. And I'm actually learning so much. Like, this is a great opportunity. It's a great example about collaboration and finding common ground.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was so beautifully said, Katrina. Now we've got about 5 minutes, and like I promised everyone at the beginning, the only thing that would cheat us today is time. So we're going to do a dash towards beating it, attempting to beat it. In this last 5 minutes, I think there's been a lot that's been shared already. But as we attempt to draw the curtain on this, is there something pertinent? Is there something you think, here's how I would like to ribbon tie all of this today? Or even if it's a question, I'm a proponent of the fact that, we don't get into spaces like this to answer all of the questions. So if there is a question, if there is something you've come across, a resource that you want to leave people with today, please. And this time I'm going to invite you popcorn style. Please just unmute your mic and step into that space in the next 4 minutes.
Ruth, I'm just going to take 30, 60 seconds, if I may. First, just much gratitude to all of you. I've learned so much today, and thank you for being in my lives. And I thank all the audience who have taken time to be with us this morning. Don't laugh, but chatgpt.com can actually be your friend. And I say this very, very seriously. Not perfect, because it's a disruptive technology that's just in the making. It's in its baby years. I invite every single one of you this evening or today, just go to chatgpt.com. It's a free resource, and type the prompt: how many equity-seeking groups are there in Canada? Simple. It'll spit out to you. It just did. I checked it a few minutes ago. It's a long list. You add it all up. It's more than a dozen. Under each category, there are thousands of organizations. So you can go and give a second prompt and say, for this category, how many? And you can go deeper, deeper, deeper. Within seconds, it'll whip out information that is already there in the Internet of Things. Why am I ending with this? I'm ending with this to go back to something. We have done a phenomenal job of having all these groups recognized in one shape or form, and then having funding streams to support their work in small ways. Divide and rule. I urge every single one of us here to be committed to human rights, the umbrella of human rights. Let all these organizations be there. Let them all thrive. Let them all survive. Let them all get funded. Let's sign up for whatever makes sense to us. But let's all commit to human rights. To me, that's the umbrella. That's the glue that can hold this very polarized, fragmented group together. And if we want to shift the needle in a significant way and make sure that we don't have to wait 100 years, we've got to all commit to something that holds us together, safeguards, respects, and celebrates our complex identities, but gives us a common umbrella under which we can all stand in the shade and be protected from the storm. So thank you, and I wish you all well.
Thank you so much for that, Sobhana. Thank you. Okay, the roving mic, who's stepping in next?
I'll chime in just with a little bit of not a joke, but my husband works in academic technology and has been talking about ChatGPT for years before it became popular. So he will be very happy, Shobna, with your prompts. And I will be sure to tell him that again, it came up today because it's almost like it's his. He's so happy with it. For me, I think one of the things that's really critical is that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon, as cliche as that sounds. You asked about resiliency earlier, Ruth, and I think that with so much conversation that's been happening for years and years and years, I think expectations can grow and then there can be sense of disappointment, right? Because progress is very slow. So I think that regardless of those waves of, excitement and then disappointment and excitement and disappointment, we really have to find our people that are committed to the long haul and to moving the dial over the long term and just not give up. Like we really can't give up. And I often think about the next generations, I have a lot of privilege, but there's obviously still barriers to being a woman of color in leadership. I want a smoother ride for my daughter if she ever has these opportunities. And so for me, it's not to say that I have that weight carrying me, but it's one of the motivations that doesn't allow me to give up and step back because we do need to create that change. And if we give up, then who's going to do it, right? So that definitely is one of the drivers for me. And I think that the flip side of that is really knowing when to take a break, when to embrace self-care and fill ourselves up so that we're not giving away too much of our energy and our ourselves so that we can be in it for the long haul. So I think really just knowing yourself well, knowing who you can work with to stay strong and to take breaks when needed, and then just keep going and bring people along the way as much as is possible with you. Those are sort of my hopes. That's how I coach myself and maybe what I'll offer to the audience here today as well.
Thank you so much, Zahra. We'll take another 2 minutes. Any closing thoughts?
I'm conscious of time, so I was going to let it be, but I think I would just add to what has been said that Shobna started it, and there's been a thread here. Don't be well behaved. We haven't got here because people were well behaved. I grew up with my father calling me Murte in our language, means rebel child. I have memories of everything from speaking up. I had this random, very patriarchal uncle that used to say, girls don't whistle, so I'll walk through the house whistling. I was telling the story the other day or even we started with talking about gender equity and women's rights and violence against women. I have this distinct memory. I had the opportunity to be on the news talking about the change to child marriage rules in Sierra Leone. And the story that I recalled was the fact that I had a relative, and I remember being a witness to my relative was supposed to be getting married, and I saw the bride and I just started talking. I was like, she's my age. I'm wearing a uniform, going to school tomorrow. Why is she the bride? What's going on? And my parents that are educators, community builders in public service, are like pulling me from the middle of the crowd to be like, okay. We can say this, we can do this, like be well behaved. But even then I couldn't because the audio wasn't matching the video. So I would say if you're going to be transformational in how you move through this world and stand up for human rights, what can you do? How can you show up? How can you be? And how can you interact with people to be different than the norm? And even in modeling that difference, make a difference.
Make a difference while modeling the difference. Katrina, I see you're unmuted. Please take the last word.
Very quickly, and I think just following that train of thought is that I always encourage everyone to take the actions we need to take and we can take, with our own privileges to make positive changes. But one thing that I've also learned as a person who's, struggled with trauma and then going through challenges is that we can also leave ourselves in a peaceful place and try to make sure that we always look after ourselves. And I also truly believe that celebrating us for who we are to our truest self is the most powerful way to dismantle systemic inequities. Just be true to ourselves and working together. And so this is a great forum to do that. Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Thank you all very much for the true absolute gift that this has been. Sometimes, you make all of these plans and you want to dream and hope that things will come together nicely. But I think one of the biggest rewards of working in this space is just also not knowing what it's going to be. Again, on one hand, you have hopes and dreams and all of that. Today has been not just fulfilling, it's been more than that. Thank you all very, very much. And to everyone who's joined us today, and again to people who would be watching this after the fact, we hope that there are some prompts in there. We hope that there are some stories that have challenged you, that will challenge you to look deeper. At the same time, we hope that there are some prompts for optimism, knowing that where we were 100 years ago is not where we are today, even though we're not quite where we need to be as yet. We hope that you are encouraged in knowing that there are people who are continuing with the quest, with the fight, I guess, for change, to see different, and to know that we're all part of the same tribe. Thank you all very much for sharing of your time with us today. And at this point, I'm just gonna, before I know Sandhya is gonna be coming up really shortly, but before she comes up, we didn't ignore the chat. I saw some really powerful quotes coming. I'll just highlight two of them. Ruchi said, "We need to occupy space because if we're not on the table, then we are on the menu." I think we can dissect that so many, many powerful ways. Thank you so much for sharing that, Richie. And I saw something else from Sean as well. It says, "There is only one thing worse than being dismissed. That is quitting. That is quitting. We live to fight another day." Again, we'll take it where we want to, but all around this has been truly inspiring, very insightful. And without taking much more of our time, I am very pleased now to welcome Sandhya, who once again, a number of us will remember from the last conversation that we had. And I'm going to thank every single one of you, Katrina, Sobhana, Yabome, Zahra. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. The genuineness, the generosity with which you're sharing is truly, truly unmistakable. Really very grateful and truly humbled by your gift today.